What if one small act of kindness, one plate of food given in secret, could unravel the empire of a man who believed himself untouchable? What if the waiter everyone overlooked, the man mocked, erased, humiliated, turned out to be the one person with the power to bring an entire corrupt system to its knees? This isn't just a story of revenge. It's a story of justice forged in silence, strategy born from suffering, and the unstoppable rise of a man who fed 2 forgotten children and, in doing so, changed the course of countless lives. Stay with us, because by the time you see the helicopter land on his front lawn, you'll realize the invisible man they fired never disappeared. He was just getting ready. They say a single act of kindness can echo through decades, but what happens when that echo turns into a storm powerful enough to tear down an empire? Picture this: a man washing dishes in his modest kitchen, sunlight barely creeping through. Dusty blinds, when the low hum of something foreign cuts through the silence. Not a car, not a motorcycle, but a helicopter. And it's landing in front of his tiny house. This isn't a spy movie. It's not a political thriller. This is the true story of a man named Darius Cole, once dismissed, humiliated, and discarded, whose quiet sacrifice for 2 abandoned children would ripple across decades until the sky itself opened to find him again. If you think stories about waiters and orphans are always tragic, buckle in, because this one doesn't end with pity. It ends with power and justice, and the kind of full-circle moment that makes the hairs on your arm rise. It begins not with a hero, but with a man the world had already forgotten. Darius Cole was 45 the day the helicopter landed, but his soul felt a century older. That morning he was elbow-deep in soap suds, washing a cracked plate for the 3rd time, not because it was dirty, but because his hands needed something to do while his mind wandered. He had done this so many times he could wash, rinse, and dry with his eyes closed. But on that day, the rhythmic hum of routine was shattered. The entire neighborhood froze as the sleek black chopper descended like a scene from a dream or a warning. And out stepped 2 strangers, one a tall man with the kind of tailored suit that whispered old money, the other a poised woman with eyes that had seen storms and survived. Both walked toward Darius's door like they already knew what he meant to them. He didn't panic. He didn't run. He simply dried his hands, exhaled, and walked to the door as if this moment had been etched into his soul 20 years earlier. And in a way, it had. 2 decades before, Darius had been just another black man in a white apron. He was 25, working back-to-back shifts at a prestigious but soulless restaurant called the Marbled Ivy, the kind of place where plates cost more than a week's rent, and customers never looked the waitstaff in the eye. They didn't need to. To them, people like Darius were props moving parts in a polished machine built to serve egos. During the day, Darius scrubbed floors as a janitor at a corporate building. At night, he served risotto and filet mignon to the city's elite. Not because he lacked ambition, he had a degree in business administration, earned with honors, but because caring for his ailing mother left no room for 9-to-5s or upward mobility. And one cold December night, his entire life took a turn because 2 kids showed up by the alley behind the restaurant. No shoes, shivering, ravenous. The boy's name was Jordan, 10 years old with stubborn pride in his posture, and the girl, Ava, only 8, but already learning how to disappear into the background, They didn't ask for money. They didn't cry. They just stood there, locked in the kind of silence that only the abandoned understand. Darius didn't speak either. He simply brought them food, leftovers at first, then fresh rolls from the oven, then entire plates smuggled from the kitchen. It wasn't charity, it was human decency, the kind that costs more than people realize. For 3 weeks, he fed them in secret, bypassing the cruelty of indifference with quiet acts of rebellion. Until one night, the manager won Vincent Granger, a man whose spine seemed to straighten only when he was yelling caught him. Vincent wasn't just angry, he was offended. His restaurant, a cathedral of exclusivity, was not to be desecrated with scraps given to street rats, as he so eloquently put it. And then came the words Darius would never forget. "You people never learn. You're lucky to even be here." With that, he was fired on the spot. No warning, no dignity, and certainly no justice. But this wasn't the end of Darius Cole. It was only the start of the long, painful, slow-boiling journey that would transform him from invisible server to strategic storm. Because sometimes it's not what they take from you that defines your story. It's what they awaken. And what they awakened in Darius wasn't rage, it was purpose. So he kept feeding the children, using scraps from his own fridge, selling personal belongings, taking on miserable gigs, anything to make sure Jordan and Ava didn't go to sleep hungry. He didn't do it for recognition. He did it because he remembered what it felt like to be dismissed. And the worst thing about being dismissed isn't the insult, it's the erasure. You stop being seen. But Darius? He watched everything, listened, remembered, and soon he would do something no one expected from the man they thought was just a waiter with a sob story. He would build a case, a blueprint, a takedown. Not because he hated Vincent Granger, but because there were more kids like Jordan and Ava. And he knew the real war wasn't in the kitchen. It was in the systems, the unchecked power, the whispered bigotry, the false narratives. And in Part 2, we'll peel back the layers on how Darius turned his humiliation into intelligence, his silence into strategy, and his sorrow into something so unstoppable it would someday land a helicopter on his front lawn. You would think that after being publicly humiliated, blacklisted from every reputable restaurant in the city, and forced to take degrading jobs that barely paid enough to keep the lights on, Darius would have given up, but you'd be wrong. Because some men bend and others build. While Vincent Granger and his private club cronies celebrated getting rid of the problem waiter, Darius Cole was already laying the first stone of something far more dangerous than vengeance. He was building memory. Not the kind you store in photos or souvenirs, but strategic memory, the kind you can weaponize. You see, during his time at the Marbled Ivy, Darius hadn't just served wine and cleared plates. He'd listened, really listened. And the arrogance of the powerful is that they forget the invisible are always present. Over whispered lunches and drunken after-hours parties, those men had confessed more than they realized. Fraud, tax schemes, off-the-books cash flows, racist hiring practices passed off as standards. And while they assumed Darius couldn't possibly understand the nuances of what they were saying, they had no idea he graduated top of his class in business administration. They didn't know he once dreamed of starting his own firm, a dream he shelved to care for his diabetic mother, Ruth, who reminded him often, "You have more inside you than this world is willing to admit." And when she said that, she wasn't just offering comfort. She was speaking prophecy. Because after he lost his job and fed Jordan and Ava from his own pantry until they were ripped away by the state, something in Darius broke, but not in the way they'd hoped. Not into pieces, into blueprints. He bought a notebook, started jotting down everything he could remember: names, dates, overheard conversations, even the exact times when certain suspicious delivery trucks would show up behind the restaurant with no paperwork. He didn't know what it would amount to at first. He just knew this world ran on patterns, and patterns could be traced. But what he didn't expect was that his quiet war would require even greater loss. One rainy Tuesday, his mother's condition worsened. 6 hours waiting in a public hospital. Hallway, ignored, under-prioritized, overlooked, just like him. By the time Ruth finally got a bed, her body was too weak. She died holding his hand, whispering, "Don't let the anger eat you, baby. Build something with it." That was the moment the notebook stopped being just notes. It became a blueprint for justice. Ruth's death hardened his resolve, but it also gave him clarity. This wasn't just about him. This was about every person who had ever been told to be grateful for mistreatment. Every kid who went hungry while executives drank champagne behind soundproof walls. Darius turned grief into fuel. He picked up more hours cleaning offices in the same downtown towers where men like Vincent made deals, but this time, he wasn't just earning a paycheck. He was collecting intelligence. While mopping floors and emptying trash bins, he snapped photos of documents left carelessly on desks, recorded phone calls echoing through thin walls, and cataloged financial records most companies assumed were safe from the cleaning staff. What's wild is how easily people expose themselves when they assume you don't matter. Darius mattered, and he wasn't alone. At his mother's funeral, a quiet, well-dressed man approached him. Dr. Gabriel Lynn, a tax lawyer and an old college friend of Ruth's. They talked for hours, connecting over shared experiences of marginalization, Darius as a black man, Gabriel as the son of Chinese immigrants who had clawed their way into middle-class life. When Darius showed him the notebook, Gabriel's eyes widened. "This is a compliance nuke," he said. "You're sitting on more than gossip. This is actionable." Darius nodded. "I don't want revenge," he said. "I want impact." And from that day on, they became partners not in crime, but in justice. They spent nights and weekends compiling evidence, cross-referencing data, and building a case so airtight it could survive scrutiny from the IRS, Department of Justice, and local news all at once. Meanwhile, Vincent Granger was riding high. He'd acquired 2 more restaurants, padded his bank accounts in the Cayman Islands, and was prepping a massive expansion backed by international investors. He was untouchable, or so he thought. He mocked Darius openly at networking events, joking, "The thief waiter's probably scrubbing toilets somewhere. Karma works, doesn't it?" But what Vincent didn't know was that Darius now cleaned the very building where his accountant worked. And 3 nights a week, the janitor gathered the evidence that would expose Vincent's entire empire. Some people fight fire with fire. Darius fought with facts, and precision, and patience. In the silence of office hallways and the glow of late-night computer screens, he became the kind of weapon no one sees coming. The kind forged in humility and lit by purpose. And soon, All of it, every spreadsheet, every conversation, every tax-dodging loophole would trigger a chain reaction so massive that Vincent wouldn't know what hit him. And yet, Darius didn't do it for personal gain. He did it for the children who disappeared, for the mother who died waiting for care, for the countless others who were crushed beneath the weight of someone else's entitlement. In Part 3, we'll watch that pressure explode as Darius and Gabriel pull the trigger on a plan 2 years in the making, and the cracks begin to show in Vincent's perfect facade. It started with a phone call, quiet, clinical, and devastating. On a gray Tuesday morning in March, Vincent Granger's chief accountant called his office from 3 floors below, voice trembling like a man standing at the edge of a cliff. "Mr. Granger, there's a team from the IRS here." Vincent barely looked up from his espresso. "Routine audit," he muttered, adjusting his Italian cufflinks. "Give them the sanitized books." But the voice on the other end didn't match the casual tone he expected. "Sir, they already have documents we never filed. Spreadsheets, internal memos. And they're asking about a Cayman account that only you and I know exists." And just like that, Vincent's espresso didn't taste quite right. For the first time in years, the confidence that had carried him through scandal, discrimination lawsuits, and competitor buyouts began to flicker. Across town, in a modest apartment with mismatched furniture and a laptop that ran too hot, Darius Cole was watching the morning news when his phone rang. Dr. Gabriel Lynn didn't waste time with pleasantries. "It's happening," he said. "The IRS accepted our complaint, and they're not pulling punches. 5 years of evidence. Chronological, verified. It's enough to bury him." Darius didn't speak right away. He just stared at the muted TV screen where a political analyst was discussing corruption in local business. And then he whispered, "She would have smiled." Because Ruth's fingerprints were on every part of this, not in ink, but in spirit. She raised a strategist who turned pain into precision. But this was only the opening move. Within 48 hours, Vincent's day got worse. During a high-stakes pitch to international investors, his assistant burst into the glass-walled boardroom. Face pale, breath short. "There are journalists downstairs," she whispered, panicked. "They have questions about labor violations and tax evasion." One of the German investors, a no-nonsense executive named Schmidt, narrowed his eyes. "Mr. Granger," he said, "we do not associate with criminal investigations. This deal is suspended until clarity is restored." Vincent waved it off. "Disgruntled former employee nonsense," he barked, beads of sweat beginning to collect beneath his collar. But the next morning, the front page of the city's most-read newspaper told a different story. "Food empire built on exploitation. The hidden crimes of Granger Hospitality" was the headline, printed in bold above photos of payroll discrepancies, underpaid workers, and excerpts from anonymous recordings that were far too specific to be coincidence. That anonymous source, that was Darius, the man they had erased, silenced, humiliated. He was now the ghost in every boardroom, the shadow behind every document. He didn't just gather proof. He orchestrated its release, like a symphony timed, targeted, and undeniable. But the most brutal blow wasn't financial. It was moral. In one leaked audio recording, Vincent could be heard saying, "Black employees should be grateful we let them work here. I don't pay for ambition, I pay for obedience." The backlash was immediate. Protests erupted in front of his flagship restaurant. Hashtags trended. Employee walkouts followed. Within days, licensing inspections were triggered by the health department, class action lawsuits filed by former staff, and a federal investigation initiated by the Department of Labor. Granger Hospitality was no longer a business, it was a crime scene in a suit. And the best part? Every single part of this collapse was built not on revenge but documentation. They think strategy is privilege, Darius had once told Gabriel, but strategy is just experience organized by patience. And he had been patient for years. In fact, it was at the peak of Vincent's panic that Darius made his first and only direct move. He called, not to gloat, not to threaten, just to reveal. "Hello," Vincent said, voice cracking. "Hi, boss," Darius replied, the tone calm, clipped with ironic politeness. "Remember me? The waiter you fired for. Feeding kids?" Silence. Then, how did you? How did I gather all this? Easy. I cleaned the building where your secrets lived. I listened while you bragged through thin walls. I read the spreadsheets you left on your desk while I vacuumed the floor. You saw a janitor. I saw an opportunity. This is illegal." Vincent sputtered. "You've recorded private conversations. And you've laundered millions, abused workers, and built your empire on racism," Darius said coolly. "I didn't need to fabricate anything. I just made the invisible visible." Vincent tried bargaining. "I can pay. I can fix this." But Darius only laughed, soft and steady. "You still think this is about you. I don't want a dime. Because I already got everything I needed, the truth. And now the city has it too." By the time the call ended, Vincent wasn't just defeated. He was exposed, utterly, completely. But for Darius, this wasn't the finish line. This was the turning point. Because the next step wasn't about destruction, it was about transformation. And in Part 4, that transformation will take center stage as long-lost faces return. A new legacy takes root, and the man who was once erased becomes the architect of something much bigger than revenge. 6 months after the empire collapsed, after the media frenzy subsided and the court filings became daily background noise, the city had mostly moved on, but Darius Cole hadn't. Because while Vincent Granger's face was now a symbol of everything, corrupt, arrogant, and broken about corporate power, Darius was still building, quietly, relentlessly, and this time not alone. The firm he co-founded with Gabriel Lynn had outgrown its humble beginnings. What started with a laptop, a worn notebook, and a mission had turned into one of the most respected internal auditing firms in the country, specializing in exposing labor violations and discriminatory practices in Fortune 500 companies. Darius was no longer in the shadows. His office now sat on the top floor of a sleek glass tower downtown. But even there, with a skyline view and tailored suits, he carried the same quiet fire that had sustained him through years of erasure. He didn't forget where he came from. He couldn't, and he didn't want to. Because some pain is sacred, it reminds you what matters. So on a Thursday afternoon, when his assistant knocked on the office door and said, "Sir, there's a helicopter landing on the rooftop," he didn't panic. He felt something stir, an old, familiar pull in his chest, like the return of a song you didn't know you'd forgotten. 2 people stepped out of that chopper. One, a sharply dressed man with the same fierce posture Darius remembered from decades earlier. The other, a poised woman whose eyes still carried that quiet storm. Jordan and Ava, no longer children, no longer fragile. They were who he had always hoped they'd become. And he knew them instantly. Jordan extended his hand. "Mr. Cole," he said with a voice full of strength and gratitude, "we always knew we'd find you." Darius didn't speak at first. He just stepped forward and pulled them into an embrace that felt like exhaling a burden he'd carried alone for far too long. "You've grown up," he finally whispered, "and you've become everything I believed you could be." Ava smiled, through tears, pulling a folded piece of paper from her satchel. It was worn and yellowed, edges softened by time, but Darius recognized it. It was the drawing they made the year he fed them in the alley behind the marbled ivy 3-stick figures. Standing in the rain, one holding an umbrella over the others. "We kept it," she said, "everywhere we went. You were the first person who saw us, really saw us." Jordan pulled out a folder. Not just of memories, but of plans, schematics, business proposals, non-profit strategies. They had built things of their own. Jordan was now the owner of a fast-growing restaurant chain that prioritized employing people from vulnerable communities, formerly incarcerated, formerly homeless, systemically ignored. Ava had become a human rights attorney who specialized in racial justice and corporate accountability. And they weren't here just to say thank you. They were here to build something bigger. "We want to create a foundation," Jordan said. "Vocational training centers inside restaurants, legal clinics for workers, mentorship programs for at-risk kids." Ava added, "We have funding, government partners, but we need someone who understands that social justice isn't just a legal issue, it's a personal one. We need you." Darius sat back in his chair, hands folded, silent, not because he was unsure, but because he had dreamed of this for so long and never thought the dream would find him. And now, here it was on the 40th floor of a building that would never have let him in the front door 20 years ago. "Let's do it," he said. "Let's build something they can't ignore." And so the Cole Jordan Initiative was born, not a charity, a movement. They built community kitchens that doubled as culinary schools, opened legal aid centers for families being exploited by the same kind of employers Darius once scrubbed floors for. They launched summer mentorship academies in cities with the highest youth unemployment rates. And for every success story, Darius made sure people knew this wasn't about revenge. It was about repair. "Revenge is a spark," he told students in one of his public lectures, "but justice is a bridge, and bridges carry people." Meanwhile, Vincent Granger had become a footnote, a former Titan reduced to managing a gas station on the edge of town, his suits replaced with stain-covered palas. The club friends who once toasted him now looked away when they passed him at the grocery store. And yet, the poetic symmetry wasn't in his fall, it was in Darius's rise. Because while Vincent sat in silence behind a glass counter selling lottery tickets, Darius was helping thousands rewrite the odds. The media caught on. Business schools wrote case studies. News anchors ran features on how one man's quiet resistance toppled an empire and birthed a movement. And when asked on national television what he would say to someone going through the kind of discrimination he once faced, Darius said this: "Remember that you are not what they call you. You are what you build in spite of them. And if you build long enough, wide enough, and loud enough, you won't just rise, you'll carry others with you." In Part 5, we'll explore the full impact of the Cole Jordan Initiative, the nationwide ripple effect, and the final lesson Darius leaves behind for a generation learning to turn silence into structure and injustice into legacy. 2 years later, the Cole Jordan Initiative was no longer a dream born from a rooftop reunion. It had become a national benchmark for justice, built from the ground up. Across 8 states, vocational restaurants were running at full capacity, each serving as both a community gathering place and a training hub for youth who had been ignored by traditional systems. In neighborhoods where dropout rates once surged and opportunity felt like a distant rumor, the lights now stayed on late into the night, stoves sizzling, aprons tied tight, young voices laughing, learning, and leading. More than 500 children had passed through the Foundation's educational programs, some going on to open cafes of their own, others returning as mentors. Over 2,000 families had received free legal counsel, guided by Ava Jordan and a team of passionate advocates who believed justice didn't belong only to those who could afford it. Corporate boardrooms that once operated unchecked now feared the weight of internal audits spearheaded by Cole and Lynn Consulting, whose name had become synonymous with ethical reckoning. And Darius was no longer the invisible man behind the mop. He was the keynote speaker at university commencements, the guest lecturer in ethics seminars, the quiet voice behind sweeping reforms in labor policy. And yet, even at the height of recognition, he never let go of the image of his mother's hands gently bandaging his scrapes, whispering, "Build, baby, don't break." That whisper lived in every interview he gave, every program he approved, every child he knelt beside to say, "I see you. You're not invisible." National media asked him over and over, "How did you do it? How did one man go from fired waiter to dismantler of corporate corruption?" And each time his answer was the same. "I stopped believing what they said I was and started remembering who I knew I could be." The Cole Jordan Foundation began expanding internationally. Partnerships were forged in South Africa, in Brazil, in refugee centers across Europe. And at each ribbon-cutting ceremony, Darius never stood in front of the camera. He stood beside the kids, always beside them. Because he knew the story was never about one man toppling a giant. It was about the hands that fed others long before they had anything of their own. Still, not everyone forgot Vincent Granger. His name came up in textbooks as a warning, a case study in arrogance unrestrained. His voice, once feared, was now dissected in college classes about structural inequality and executive downfall. He still lived in the city, although few recognized him. His posture had changed. The sharpness in his step had dulled. And every now and then, someone would whisper, "Isn't that the guy who—" But he would keep walking, silent, small, and perhaps that was justice, too, not humiliation, but a life diminished by the very values he once used to justify cruelty. On a quiet winter evening, Darius walked alone down the alley behind what used to be the marbled ivy, now transformed into a culinary training center. The brick walls remained, but the coldness was gone. Inside, warm light spilled through the windows, and laughter rang out over simmering pots. A young boy was stirring soup under the guidance of a chef who once walked these same streets in silence. Darius stood there for a moment, watching through the glass. Not as a founder, not as a leader, but as a man who had once handed bread to 2 shivering children in that very spot and been fired for it. Now generations would be fed because of that moment. And that, he thought, is the long shape of justice. It doesn't always shout. Sometimes it simply grows. And what had grown here, out of pain, out of erasure, out of sheer stubborn love, was unstoppable. In his final public interview, a journalist asked, "What would you say to someone experiencing what you did, discrimination, dismissal, being unseen?" And Darius looked into the camera with steady eyes and said, "The difference between revenge and justice is simple. Revenge breaks, justice builds. I didn't destroy the man who destroyed me. I replaced him, and I built something better in the ruins he left behind." The journalist paused, then asked, "And if you could go back, would you do anything differently?" Darius smiled, not the smile of a man who won, but of a man who arrived. "I'd keep washing the dishes. I'd still feed those kids. Because doing the right thing isn't always rewarded, but it's always remembered." And so the story ends not with revenge, not with retribution, but with renewal. In classrooms and kitchens, in legal clinics and community centers, Darius's name is quietly passed on, not as a martyr, not even as a hero, but as proof. Proof that one act of compassion can ripple through decades. That being underestimated is not a weakness, it's a shield. That the world can take your job, your dignity, your title, but it cannot erase your worth. And most importantly, that every child helped, every policy changed, every voice amplified through the Cole Jordan Foundation is one more answer to the question Vincent Granger never thought to ask, what if the man you tried to bury wasn't done growing yet? True justice is not loud or cruel. It is patient, strategic, and transformational. It doesn't just tear down the structures of injustice. It builds new ones in their place where compassion leads, dignity thrives, and the underestimated finally take their place at the table.